Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm going to talk about how to play Vengeance Demon Hunter in Dragonflight Patch 10.2. This is primarily going to focus on how to play the class. It's a guide after all. If you want more of a deep dive on the philosophy of the class, you should check out the State of the Class video I made a few weeks ago. And with that being said, let's just get right into it. We'll start with the changes that are being made in patch 10.2. Unlike the 5 other tanks, which have all been fundamentally unchanged or gotten slightly nerfed in patch 10.2, Vengeance Demon Hunters have gotten a massive rework and a huge buff with the new patch. That's why I chose to do them first instead of the usual Monk and Warrior. So here are the broad strokes. In general, it's the same class. It has the same strengths and the same weaknesses. The main differences are that the strengths are increased and the weaknesses are decreased. Additionally, since we looked at it and tested it on the PTR, more testing and sim data has been accumulated, and the playstyle is a bit different from how it was in Season 2, and a lot more like how it was in Season 1, and how it plays normally in raids. This is a good thing because not only is it tankier than ever, it also deals a huge amount of damage. There's a small pair of nerfs rolling out with the upcoming weekly reset, and those are a 20% nerf to the damage of the tier set proc, which is fine. Relatively small damage nerf overall, and a 5% reduction to the parry chance granted by illuminated sigils, which is also fine. It makes sense. Even after that nerf, it's still an insanely strong talent. So here's the deal. Vengeance Demon Hunter is better than ever in Mythic Plus. It's just extremely strong there, and it is also decent in raids. It's not a top tier peak of powers raid tank choice, but it's very playable. You know, that's kind of true for all specs outside of the highest possible end of play, where everything needs to be optimized to the absolute limit, but hey, Vengeance Demon Hunter, totally fine in raids, totally dominant in Mythic Plus. The main rotational changes are that sigils now become a core rotational part of your toolkit. In general, this just means that using Sigil of Flame is a lot more important, and maintaining it at close to 100% uptime is kind of a key component of the class. And using your utility sigils like Sigil of Silence and Sigil of Misery help with that. They have an indirect damage value now too, which is pretty awesome for utility skills. Also, Elysian Decree is back on the menu, and Fodder to the Flame has been removed entirely. Many talents have been buffed. Many 2-point talents in the trees have been cut down to 1-point talents. In some cases, the amount of stat budget or whatever that you got is increased relative to what it was before per point. In some cases, you just get 2 points worth of value for 1 point. In either case, this all allows for a lot more freedom in the trees, a lot more pathing openings, and the talent trees are just a lot better constructed now than they were before. In terms of how the class plays, Vengeance Demon Hunters are the Swiss Army knife of tanks. They have decent self-healing, nothing like a Blood DK, but good self-healing, and they combine a mixture of healing based on damage taken with Leech. This makes them particularly strong as AoE tanks. The class also has layers and layers of damage reduction effects. Most of them aren't extremely strong, like Protection Warrior's defensive stance, for example, but when you have one layer on top of another, on top of another, on top of another, it really adds up to a lot. Most of this power comes through generating and spending resources. We're talking either Soul Fragments with Spirit Bomb or Fury with Soul Cleave. You also have tons of group utility in the form of crowd control effects. You have an AoE Stun, an AoE Silence, an AoE Fear, Sigil of Chains, a single target Incapacitate, you can offensively Dispel, and you bring the Demon Hunter debuff, by far the most useful debuff in Blizzard's evil debuff matrix. This is all amazing in Mythic Plus. Unfortunately in raids, it falls a little flat. You just don't need CC all that much in raids, and a lot of Demon Hunter's kit tends toward parrying or mitigating auto attacks. Not all of it, but, you know, a lot of it. There's still plenty of appealing stuff for Vengeance Demon Hunter to do and bring to a raid, but it's not quite the powerhouse in raids that it is in Mythic Plus. Now let's talk about the tier set. Demon Hunter's new tier set bonuses add a lot of extra power into the new Sigil playstyle. They really reinforce this whole redesign. They clearly were made with each other in mind, and I think that's fantastic. The 2-piece bonus makes it so that when you attack a target affected by your Sigil of Flame, your damage and healing are increased by 2% and your stamina is increased by 2%. This lasts for 8 seconds and stacks up to 5 times, and the goal here is to have 100% uptime on Sigil of Flame, so obviously you would have 100% uptime on this as well. Basically, you get 10% more damage and healing, 10% more stamina. That's a pretty amazing 2-piece. 8 seconds is enough in conjunction with all the other class bonuses that even if you do let your Sigil of Flame uptime slip a little bit, you should be able to maintain 100% uptime on this bonus, and stacking it back up is pretty easy. I still wouldn't mind if the duration was increased a bit. 10 seconds, even 15 would be a little bit more forgiving when it comes to dealing with bosses that have like invulnerability intermissions and raids, or when moving between groups and dungeons. You know, moving out of melee range to deal with a boss mechanic in raid, having the 10% stamina buff fall off while you're also getting blasted, that kind of sucks. The 4-piece bonus gives Sigil of Flames periodic damage a chance to flare up, shattering an additional soul fragment from the target and dealing extra damage. That number has been reduced by 20% as of a few hours ago. And more importantly, for every 40 Fury you spend, Sigil of Flames cooldown is reduced by 1 second. From some preliminary testing, this 4-piece is worth about 3 to 5% more damage in the extra procs. Maybe that's more like 3 to 4% more damage now that that's been nerfed. It isn't a ton, but it also adds 10 to 15% more soul fragments, and those also translate to a fair amount of extra damage and healing. They can be wasted. They are just random spawns. They may already spawn when you already have 5 and just be free healing, but even so, that's still good. And I think generally speaking, it all balances out. You certainly can't be upset about having more soul fragments available. Now, as for the cooldown reduction, it's a bit harder to quantify due to Cycle of Binding also adding a lot of cooldown reduction, but in general, this is conservatively worth 30 to 35% cooldown reduction on Sigil of Flame just from the 4-piece. So we're talking an average cooldown of around 12 to 15 seconds on Sigil of Flames, and that's pretty amazing. It makes it pretty easy to maintain 100% uptime on Sigil of Flame in a normal tanking situation. Altogether, this is a fantastic tier set. It's worth 15 to 20% more damage in all situations, 10% more healing, and 10% more health, about 35% cooldown reduction on Sigil of Flame, 10% more soul fragments. It's great, and it synergizes with the new talent build and really reinforces the concept really nicely. I love it. Now let's talk about talents. Alright, so I have 3 talent builds that I want to run through, sort of a standard Mythic Plus build, a standard raid build, and then a defensive alternative that is more oriented toward Mythic Plus, but you can very easily make some modifications to it if you felt you needed to use it for raid. I think that the defensive alternative build probably is just worse overall, but yeah, maybe it's useful for some like very hard-hitting content or if you're super under-geared. So we'll start with the Mythic Plus one, and I kind of want to start by just looking at what I consider the like must-have talents for each of these builds. So Fellblade and Aura of Pain have been decoupled from each other, you know, shifted away from being a choice node, and so Fellblade is actually a pretty great talent now. It's really, really nice that it's just so easily available. And it fills a really good gap in the rotation to be able to press that button and suddenly have a bunch of Fury to be able to use a Spirit Bomb or a Soul Cleave and not have to like use Fracture or Immolation Aura or one of your other builders that may not be available. There are some other things here like Elysian Decree, just a really great offensive cooldown, really deals a lot of damage, a lot of burst damage in AoE, and so this is a really great option for AoE, which Mythic Plus is primarily about AoE, so you go with Elysian Decree here. Now, because of the way that the talent tree has been reshuffled, it's not possible to get all 3 of these capstones anymore. The Hunt is the one in the middle. It's the best of these 3 capstones, Collective Anguish, the Hunt, and Elysian Decree. The Hunt is the number 1. So you do want to come down here and get the Hunt. That is the primary goal. And you get that minute off of Metamorphosis's cooldown as well. So really just very valuable points coming down here. You can come through Soul Sigils, get that lesser soul fragment every time you afflict an enemy with a sigil. Definitely better in Mythic Plus as a talent than in Raid, since you're afflicting enemies a lot more often with sigils. Now, it's only 1 fragment, regardless of whether you hit 1 enemy or 50, but that still adds up to a lot of fragments over the course of, over the course of a Mythic Plus run. Add an extra 5 fragments a minute, something like that is actually pretty good. In Raid, this is quite a bit weaker. So in Raid, you maybe would want to take Darkness if you felt like you needed to. It is something I've taken in the Mythic Plus talent setup. And I like Internal Struggle just because it's a bit of stat budget, but you could very easily drop that and take Pitch Black and get some cooldown reduction on your Darkness. That's totally fine. There's quite a bit of wiggle room in the middle of the tree. Like, I like Champion of the Glaive, 2 charges on Throw Glaive, a bit of extra reach on it. You could take Master of the Glaive and get this, not spammable, but a usable ranged slow. That could be useful in some situations. Feel like it's more annoying in a lot of them. You could also take Chaos Fragments and get a small chance of spawning Soul Fragments whenever you use Chaos Nova. I would rather have the consistent move speed from Pursuit, but that's just me. I also didn't take Vengeful Retreat, so like I said, you have a lot of options here where you can take Vengeful Retreat. A lot of stuff that is sort of a personal preference. I didn't really like the initial implementation of Live by the Glaive either, but they buffed it a lot, and the Fury generation and health over the span of time when you parry, it's pretty good. You really do parry a lot in Mythic Plus, so this really does actually add up to a decent amount of healing and resource generation over the course of a Mythic Plus, considering how cheap it is. You know, it's a point in the middle of a tree. Now, over here in the right-hand tree, there are a lot of really great talents. Things like Volatile Flame Blood add up to a ton of Fury. Fallout generates a lot of Soul Fragments over the course of a dungeon. Spirit Bomb is your main spender. Obviously, you're going to take that. And then you really have to make some difficult choices down here in the bottom of the tree. You can take Feed the Demon in Last Resort. That's sort of the alternate, more passive defensive build, but you just get so much more damage and damage reduction and leech out of running the Frailty build. Taking Soul Crush, Vulnerability, all these things that lead down here. And then Dark Glare Boon is pretty non-negotiable. It just adds so much cooldown reduction onto a major defensive cooldown. It synergizes nicely with Demonic. It has some other good talent synergies. Just a really, really great talent in general. Adds a lot of damage, defensive value, healing even. Pretty amazing. Now you have Chains of Anger over here, which adds 2 seconds onto the duration of your sigils. This is really important for maintaining that Sigil of Flame uptime, and the radius increase is nice too, just for hitting more enemies. You also have Cycle of Binding. That cooldown reduction on all your sigils is so crucial for maximizing your utility in groups, but mainly just for like having 100% Sigil of Flame uptime, which is critical. You also get Sigil of Flame uptime increase through Charred Flesh and Immolation Aura, so you want to have Charred Flesh. You also want to have Agonizing Flames to increase your Immolation Aura uptime. Lot of value there. You know, you have so many talents that synergize with Immolation Aura. Volatile Flame Blood, Fallout, Agonizing Flames, Infernal Armor. Tons and tons of great stuff from that. Void Reaver, kind of a big part of why Frailty is so good. Getting damage reduction from every stack of Frailty, getting damage increase from every stack of Frailty, getting Leech from Frailty. All pretty great. And then the thing that really ties the whole sigil build together is Illuminated Sigils. And this is an absolute must-have in Mythic Plus builds. You get 2 charges on all of your sigil skills, so like I can show off here. Just back-to-back Elysian Decrees, back-to-back Sigil of Flames, back-to-back Sigil of Miseries. Pretty amazing. And all of that works really nicely with all of the other sigil talents that you have. And then 20% parry chance. Now that's being nerfed to 15% with the launch of Season 3, but that's still a massive amount of parry chance considering that you can have pretty close to 100% uptime on Sigil of Flame. Even if you're at 80% uptime, 15% parry chance from having Sigil of Flame on an enemy is amazing, especially when you add in Deflecting Spikes, giving you 15% parry chance. You know, with absolutely nothing going, I have around 20% parry chance, so you add those together, that's another 30%, sitting around 50% parry chance all the time, but also you have good armor and healing and damage reduction from things like vulnerability. It's pretty crazy. Now, an astute observer might notice that Painbringer isn't taken here. Painbringer is one really wonderful defensive layer, and the main reason we're not taking it is because it is a 2-pointer still, and the option is either getting a 1-pointer in Soul Furnace and being able to kind of cleanly path through. Soul Furnace adds a little bit of extra damage onto occasional Spirit Bombs. Basically every other Spirit Bomb will hit 40% harder. It's pretty good, but you could drop Soul Furnace and drop Volatile Flame Blood probably is the best thing to drop. It is a pretty good resource generator, but that's probably the thing to drop. It would be that or Calcified Spikes to get Painbringer, but then you're kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul. As, I don't know, 1,000-year-old people would say, you're stealing one damage reduction bonus that's really good to get another one that's really good. I think I probably would be more willing to lose the resource generation as good as it is if I really needed the damage reduction from Painbringer, but I don't think you do. I think you get along just fine without it unless you're trying to really push the absolute maximum on keys. Okay, now one annoying little thing that I was just reminded of is that if you have illuminated sigils and any of your sigils are on cooldown, you cannot swap talents. I had to wait about 90 seconds there because I had blasted Sigil of Misery out, but now let's swap over and look at the raid talent setup. Now the raid setup is obviously not all that different. You'll notice a couple of things have changed here, though. For one, we're not taking Elysian Decree. It's not as good for single target damage. It's certainly not as easy to use as Collective Anguish, and you're better off just going over toward Collective Anguish. Additionally, there's a lot of auto attack oriented stuff that's not in here. Things like Extended Spikes, great in Mythic Plus, awesome in Mythic Plus. Not that useful in raids. Things like Sigil of Silence, really not going to be silencing that many bosses in raids, so not all that important. We're still taking the Hunt, still taking Collective Anguish, still taking Demonic and Fellblade and all that kind of stuff, but we are emphasizing more things like Vengeful Retreat is a priority. We're also coming over here and taking Meteoric Strikes to get that cooldown on reduction on Infernal Strike, and then between Meteoric Strikes and Erratic Fellheart, we are we're getting UI errors, but anyways, we are getting a 8-second cooldown on Infernal Strike, which is just amazing for dealing with raid mechanics. You basically are able to just bounce around all over the place like you're on a pogo stick, which is pretty nice. Again, we're not going through Painbringer, mainly just as an issue of pathing. However, if we needed to, if we felt like we needed a little bit more damage reduction, dropping Fallout in Mythic Plus is pretty hard to justify. It really generates so many soul fragments in Mythic Plus. In Raid, not so much. So you could much more easily justify dropping Fallout and Soul Furnace, put those points into Painbringer, and then there you go. Now you've got another massive defensive layer that's pretty great. Additionally, I've taken Soul Carver. I just kind of like the on-demand press button do damage option there, but you could just as easily drop this if you wanted something a little simpler and take Stoke the Flames here. Additionally, if it is an AoE fight, there aren't really that many in the raid, but you could take Burning Alive if you wanted a little bit more damage reduction, a little bit more layers of damage reduction. But generally speaking, the raid setup is going to look about like this. This is sort of an more or less optimal damage-oriented setup. Now you'll note that we haven't taken Illuminated Sigils, and that's because all that parry chance in raid, not really as important. Down in Flames actually winds up adding more damage. You get more Fiery Brand availability, like a lot more, so that's good defensively. Main defensive cooldown has a much shorter cooldown and an additional charge, pretty great. But also, Fiery Demise, big synergy there, getting a lot more uptime on not just your best defensive cooldown, but one of your best offensive cooldowns too. And now I want to look at that middle path talent tree, not using any skills, not putting myself on cooldown on anything so that I can't swap. Okay, so once again, this is more Mythic Plus oriented, but it's going through the middle of the bottom of the tree here. I've also taken a lot of the utility stuff. So we're able to get Painbringer pretty easily because we're not coming over and getting Void Reaver, Soul Furnace, Soul Crush. We're not doing any of the frailty stuff here. We would be going straight down the middle of the tree, having very easy 100%, well over 100% uptime actually on Demon Spikes, thanks to Feed the Demon and Extended Spikes and all the soul fragments that we're going to be generating. Again, you're able to get Sigil of Chains, you're getting Burning Alive, you're getting all the utility you would want in Mythic Plus, even Last Resort. The only real problem here is you're losing a lot of damage, and frankly, you're losing a lot of damage reduction through the combination of Soul Crush, Frailty, and Void Reaver. So I don't actually think that this is a better talent setup, but it is a simpler one and maybe a little bit more familiar for people who played Demon Hunter a fair amount in Mythic Plus in Season 2. This might be sort of a way to transition into the other playstyle. I think you're probably better off just going with the other one, but this is an alternative you could consider if you feel like, hey, I'm kind of feeling a little less tanky than I expected here, or maybe like struggling with some of the more active builder spender aspects of the other playstyle. And then additionally, I just put this point in Stoke the Flames here, but you could very reasonably move this over to Soul Carver if you wanted more active damage, or Volatile Flameblood if you just wanted more resource generation. If you wanted to do sort of a super tanky raid version of this setup, you could do A build that looks something like this. You would drop Elysian Decree probably, pick up Soul Carver instead of Stoke the Flames, and then have something along these lines. Maybe you would drop Burning Alive and take Stoke the Flames instead. If it's a raid setup where it's single target, you're getting that extra damage from Stoke the Flames, you're getting damage from Collective Anguish, and, all of that, Soul Carver, but then you're not giving up Last Resort. You're able to keep Last Resort, that seatbelt, keeping you alive in raids. The problem, I think, with this for a raid build is just that Feed the Demon and Demon Spike's uptime just isn't all that valuable. I think you're better off getting the more generic damage reduction that you get from Frailty. But it's an option. Maybe the value of Last Resort as an extra defensive cooldown just makes you feel safer than the more active damage reduction of Frailty. Either way, those are the 3 builds that I've cooked up, and let's get back to it. All right, now we'll move on to abilities. Demon Hunter is sort of the ultimate form of the builder-spender playstyle that Blizzard has created for classes in WoW over the years. You generate Fury and Souls with Fracture, Immolation Aura, now Fellblade, and Sigil of Flame, and then you spend those with Spirit Bomb and Soul Cleave. In general, you want to build and spend both Soul Fragments and Fury as much as you can at all times. This is a bit of a shift from how the class played in Mythic Plus in Season 2 of Dragonflight. You really don't want to let any of your resources go to waste in Season 3. The skills that generate Fury pretty much all generate souls and vice versa. The one exception is Fellblade, which generates a ton of Fury and doesn't generate any souls. Because of this, consuming Fury and souls is also pretty much inextricable from each other. They're linked together. In general, you want to use Spirit Bomb when you have 4 or 5 soul fragments available, and you want to do that without exception. The goal there is to make sure that you're always consuming those soul fragments with Spirit Bomb. You want to use Soul Cleave to spend extra Fury when you have no soul fragments available. That is really the key on how you use your 2 spenders. The cap on active fragments is 5. So if you're at 4 or 5, you don't want to generate more soul fragments without consuming them first. That would be a waste of potential damage. You would spawn out to 6 and then waste one of them. You don't want to Spirit Bomb with fewer than 4 fragments either, as that wastes Fury, and it can make you have to waste souls later while you're generating enough Fury to cast Spirit Bomb. So if you have leftover Fury immediately after casting Spirit Bomb, and you often will, and no souls available, that is when you use Soul Cleave to dump out the rest of your Fury. In general, it goes like this. Generate souls and Fury, cast Spirit Bomb to eat up the souls, dump the rest of your Fury with Soul Cleave to generate more Frailty stacks, then start generating more souls and Fury. It's a back and forth cycle. You generate 2 resources at once, consume one, consume the other, generate both of them up again, consume one, then the other, repeat, repeat, repeat. The key to playing well is making sure that you're never actively wasting resources or wasting the cooldowns that generate those resources. That means you don't want to let Fracture, Immolation Aura, or Sigil of Flame sit on cooldown. The same kind of goes for Fellblade as well, although it's a little bit lower in the priority than those others. Again, souls should always be consumed with Spirit Bomb. I just really want to underline that. That is the top priority above everything else, and sometimes it's easier said than done. Souls have a delay on when they spawn. Sometimes you accidentally walk into them. It's stupid that they're designed to function like that, and it's not the end of the world if you walk into them. It's just not ideal. Let me make one important note here before moving on. All of this stuff is only true if you're playing the Soul Crush build, the Frailty build. Now, most people probably will be, so this probably does apply. Just be aware that if you choose not to play the Soul Crush build, you're not going to be able to stack Frailty, so you're not going to care about the Soul Cleave stuff, you're not really going to care as much about dumping Fury. The playstyle in that build, without Soul Crush, is just build the fragments, spin them with Spirit Bomb, and everything else doesn't really matter. Now let's talk about cooldowns. Your offensive cooldowns are pretty simple. You have Fell Devastation, which is a combination of an offensive and defensive cooldown, and because it heals you for a bunch and grants you 6 seconds of meta, your biggest defensive cooldown, you kind of want to treat it like a defensive layer of its own. In most situations, especially in Mythic Plus, you'll want to use Fell Dev as often as you can, like an offensive cooldown. With the baseline reduction of its cooldown in this patch and the increased availability of Dark Glare Boon, the average cooldown on Fell Devastation is under 30 seconds now. It's 27 or 28 seconds on average, which is pretty amazing. Now, if you're at the end of a pull in Mythic Plus, or you're at a situation where ads are going to spawn in the next 10 seconds in raid, you probably will want to hold it a bit to burn down those ads or to pick up a pack of mobs in the next Mythic Plus pull. Establish AoE threat and dominance. Additionally, since it is a huge defensive cooldown, you can use it preemptively to proc meta and live through big tank hits, like to use a boss I was just tanking earlier tonight, Rashok. If Rashok is about to do his big tank combo, I would hit Fell Devastation beforehand so that I had meta up for that. Elysian Decree is a sigil despite not having sigil in the name. It interacts with all of your other sigil talents. It just deals a huge burst of AoE damage and spawns 3 soul fragments. It's simple, but pretty good. Soul Carver is a single target damage cooldown that generates a bunch of souls over a couple of seconds, and it deals a lot of damage. It's really good for quickly building up the souls you need for a Spirit Bomb, kind of like Elysian Decree. They're both in that same sort of vein. Soul Carver is much more of a raid-oriented cooldown. It's not mutually exclusive with Elysian Decree. You can talent into both, but they are in tension with each other since Soul Carver is all about single target damage and Elysian Decree is all about AoE damage. Again, you can use both together, but there's a decent chance that you won't. Using both in a single setup is kind of asking for unnecessary, annoying bar bloat. The Hunt is a really simple, really strong offensive cooldown. I really like it. It just does a long distance charge, has a cool sound, cool animation, does a lot of single target damage, and applies a decent sized dot to everything you travel through. It also gives you a large leech bonus against the primary target. Now in Mythic Plus, you can usually just use your cooldowns on cooldown for the most part, and you'll be good, since Soul Carver deals fire damage. If you are using that, whether you're in single target or, raid, Mythic Plus, wherever, you're going to want to have Fiery Brand active on the target before you use it. In single target situations, so generally in raid, but also maybe on tyrannical Mythic Plus bosses, you are going to want to try to get stacks of frailty up on enemies before you use your cooldowns so that the damage is multiplied by all those frailty stacks. It's pretty simple. Frailty gives you 4% more damage per stack, so you can get 5 or 6 stacks of frailty up on a target, then hit them with the Hunt. It's going to do 20 or 24% more damage. Since the Hunt and Soul Carver can deal a couple 100,000 damage in a single global cooldown, getting those frailty stacks up first is really, it's crucial for maximizing your damage. So you wouldn't want to use the Hunt as your opening global cooldown on a fight, for example. That's one of the biggest mistakes I've seen from Demon Hunters in raid. You could maybe justify it if that allows an extra use during like a perfect moment of fight timing, but that's so rare. Just no, don't even think about it. Just get frailty up and then use your cooldowns. Even if all you get is one Spirit Bomb cast and a Soul Cleave off before using your main cooldowns, that's still 3 stacks for a 12% damage increase. Ideally, you'll want to get somewhere between 4 and 6 stacks of frailty up before casting your cooldowns. But whatever. The admin of Fellblade as a usable talent really does help a lot with that early burst of Fury generation too. The same goes for Fell Dev and Fiery Brand as well, since they do hit fairly hard. Now let's go over your main defensive skills. You have Demon Spikes, which is a very simple active mitigation skill, easiest and simplest in the game. You press the button, your armor goes up, that's it. It's a really important defensive layer when you are tanking in Mythic Plus, and you should make good use of it whenever you're tanking. I mean, it's useful in raid too. It's just super simple. The worst thing you can do is not hit Demon Spikes enough. You will take a lot less damage whenever you have it active. Now, thanks to calcified spikes, losing or refreshing demon spikes is an important defensive layer as well. This is a change from before patch 10.2, and it's a really good one. You don't have to consistently wait for demon spikes to fall off and then recast it. You can just push the button while it's already active, and that will also give you calcified spikes. Great stuff. Soul Cleave and Spirit Bomb are both self-heals, and the soul fragments they consume also heal you for a percentage of all the damage you've taken recently, like a very watered down version of Blood Death Knight's Death Strike. It's not as big of a component of your core defensive toolkit as Death Strike is. It's just one ingredient in the stew, along with everything else you have going on. As for your defensive cooldowns, you have Metamorphosis and you have Fiery Brand. Those are basically the only two, and they are super important. Fiery Brand is a single target shield wall, and thanks to burning alive, it spreads to nearby enemies, massively increasing its value in AoE, which is a big part of why Demon Hunter is capable of being tanky in Mythic Plus. Fiery Brand is also a major offensive cooldown as well due to Fiery Demise. It gives you 50% more fire damage on targets while it's active on them, and most of your damage is fire, so it's a really powerful offensive cooldown. There are a few exceptions. Elise Decree is not fire, the Hunt is not fire. I'm sure I could think of some other stuff, auto attacks, fracture, that kind of thing, but most of your damage is fire. Also, Fiery Brand just hits really hard, so just a really strong cooldown all around. Metamorphosis is your other big defensive cooldown. It is a massive boost to your health and armor, and it is only on a 2-minute cooldown now, so it's basically useful for any defensive purpose. It's sort of a catch-all defensive cooldown, but on sort of more of a mid-level cooldown, which is pretty good. And I would say the main use for it is like as a proactive skill to use before a big boss hit, or as a mitigation tool when you know you're about to take a ton of damage from like a big pack of enemies in Mythic Plus. But it is good to use as a reactive defensive cooldown if your health suddenly drops low, because it gives you 50% more health. You can also pick up Last Resort, which is a cheat death that triggers Metamorphosis if you would have died, on an 8-minute internal cooldown. Now, it is a little inconvenient to reach in the current iteration of the tree, and you have to kind of give up a lot of damage, and frankly, a lot of damage reduction to get it, so I don't think it's worth getting most of the time now, but it is an option if you feel like you need it. Alright, now let's talk about how to pull on a Vengeance Demon Hunter. I know pulling packs of mobs in dungeons is challenging for newer players, and it's something I really want to emphasize. It's also something I've heard a lot about Vengeance Demon Hunter, that they have trouble with AoE threat. I've never thought this was true at all. I think they're actually one of the simpler tanks. I even wrote here, holding threat and AoE on a Demon Hunter is pretty easy. In general, what I like to do is I like to cast Sigil of Flame from range if a pack is fairly tightly stacked. If that is able to hit all of them, you're basically done at that point. But if they're not, then I'll hold Sigil of Flame until I have them all gathered up in melee range hitting my face. Either way, I want to open by Infernal Striking into the pack, not directly into the middle so that I'm like surrounded on all sides by enemies, getting hit in the back and killed. You want to leap toward one side. You want to leap to the side of the pack that is closer to you so that you will hit them all, but they'll all be in front of you so you can parry them. While you're in the air, you hit Demon Spikes and Immolation Aura as soon as you reach the pack of enemies. If you have 4 or more souls, you can Spirit Bomb straight away. Otherwise, I would Fracture once, then Spirit Bomb, and that's pretty much it. You have threat now. Just do your normal rotation, use Sigil of Flame if you didn't before, cast Fiery Brand, a couple of Fractures, Fell Devastation, Spirit Bomb, cooldowns, and so on. Alright, in terms of stats, Demon Hunters want to enchant and gem for haste and crit. Haste is the best overall stat in my opinion. It feels the best, which isn't a mathematical thing, it just feels good in terms of rotation and shortening your cooldown and bringing abilities off a cooldown sooner. Crit is a little less reliable defensively, but it's great for damage, and as a Vengeance Demon Hunter, damage is healing, so crit is pretty great. I think Leech is probably the best option for Bracer and Cloak enchants, at least in Mythic Plus, since you deal a lot of damage and the Leech healing adds up pretty quickly. For weapon enchants, you want to use Sophic Devotion and Wafting Devotion. That's my preference. That's fine for both Raid and Mythic Plus. Some people will run double Sophic, that's fine too. As always with gearing, you really just want to maximize your item level. Always wear item level upgrades, maximize your haste and crit, that's about it. Okay, it's time to wrap things up. I love Vengeance Demon Hunter, I have for years. Really, it's so much fun to play in dungeons, and it's just really strong now. It's great. The talent rework has been a resounding success. I'm really happy to see this, and I'm really excited to play a lot of Vengeance Demon Hunter in Season 3 of Dragonflight. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.